So I have the pleasure of talking with you, not so much perhaps lecturing, but talking with you about HPB's esoteric instructions. As you know, her literary output is quite remarkable for someone whose native language was not English. I mean, she really started writing English in 1874. We really had nothing before that. So in the space of 17 years, can you imagine 14 volumes of just magazine articles, 2 major books of 2 volumes each, Isis Unveiled, Secret Doctrine, and then her lesser books. So those are the things she's really known, especially to the outside world for. But at the end of her life, she started her own school. As I pointed out yesterday, in 1875 the society was started, but in 1888 it was given a new impulse, and she started her own school. She got away from bureaucracy and all of those sort of things. It was just a secretary, and then wrote these instructions for her students. I see in the afternoon session there is suggestion for a meditative walk, but I would suggest that you take a meditative walk for those of you who have this book and read through certain parts. I've suggested that you look at the appendices, especially 1 and 2, which are 2 articles from her, one called Practical Occultism and the other called Occultism in the Occult Arts. And if you've read them already, I would say just read them again, because it pays to look over this sort of material, and then especially her preliminary memorandum about why she started this school. And perhaps we can look at the reasonings why. As I say, by 1888, she felt that the society had somewhat lost its direction. As she points out in the memorandum that opens it, that if the society had achieved great things in its existence, it had really not lived up to the ideals of it, which was to form a brotherhood of humanity, a unit. And what is a nucleus, a unit? It is a harmonious center. It doesn't mean that we have to agree with everyone or like everyone. I remember many years ago when I was working at our international headquarters, an elderly member there who I won't mention, Sita Nilakanta, pointed out someone who was walking by, and she said, "That man's an ass, but he's a theosophist." And it's interesting, there's a quote, a letter that one of the early members, Franz Hartmann, had received in 1885, and this sort of gives a little overview from one of the masters, and it says that in such a great work as this movement, no one should expect to find his associates all congenial, intuitive, prudent, or courageous. One of the first proofs of self-mastery is when one shows that he can be kind and forbearing and genial with companions of the most dissimilar characters and temperaments. One of the strongest signs of retrogression when one shows that he expects others to like what he likes and acts as he acts. Those of us who take that are expecting failure. In such a wide movement as this, that has so many dissimilar types of people, to be able to put aside our differences and work for a common goal. That is the real occultism that HPB talks about. That is the thing that has really kept this movement going and has really made it great. In most occult groups, there are a lot of like-minded people. But in ours, there's so many different types of people. And to be able to put aside our personalities and egos, even when they're being worn down and graded, to be able to show forbearance and all of those wonderful virtues is something good. So HPB starts off by saying that it is comparatively easy to become a theosophist. It's comparatively easy to become a theosophist. Any person of average intellectual capacities and a leaning toward the metaphysical, of pure unselfish life, who finds more joy in helping his neighbor than in receiving help himself, one who is ever ready to sacrifice his own pleasures for the sake of other people, who loves truth, goodness, and wisdom for their own sake, not for the benefit they may confer, is a theosophist. So that's comparatively easy, right? I'd hate to see the difficult if she's saying this is the comparatively easy. Yet, in the outside world, we meet many people who are involved in social work or have ideas of helping others where they may put aside their own interests. There have been many social movements where people have sacrificed their own particular gains for the idea of helping others, doing good. But she says, but it is quite another matter to put oneself upon the path which leads to knowledge of what is good to do as to the right discrimination of good and evil. A path which also leads a man to that power through which he can do the good he desires, often without apparently lifting a finger. She gives in Practical Occultism a number of examples of things, and in the article Occultism versus the Occult Art, she says that actually there's 4 types of esoteric knowledge that are known in the East. And for instance, Yajnavidya, which would be the performance of rites and ceremonies. There are many occult groups that are based on ceremonial and performing rites. There's Mahavidya, which is sort of the magic of the Kabbalists. There is Guhavidya, which is dealing with the powers of sounds and mantras. But she says for the Theosophist, it is Atma Vidya, which is knowledge of the soul. This knowledge of the soul is the basis of our work. Why don't you think about that for a second? So the basis of our work is really one of self-discovery. To truly know ourselves is the most remarkable things. How can we know the heart of another when we really don't even know our own selves? And yet we are all this wonderful undiscovered continent. This pathless land to many of us. And what the study of this material does is to bring all of these things to the fore. And as she points out, that a little attention to occultism increases karmic effects dramatically. This is one thing people don't realize. So when one begins to study in this area, the results of one's actions are magnified, because one is no longer wavering through life. One thing attracts us, then something else attracts us, then something else. But one then has a definite idea on a goal of what one wants. So the results and the effects are increased dramatically. So I'd like to give you a little background before we look at these instructions. Obviously, when these were published in 1888, she expected people, they were not simply opening this book with a blank before them. They had read a certain amount of literature. It's amazing to think how little was available in those early days, till about 1890. There was her first book, Isis Unveiled, which she herself said reads as if you had just taken a bunch of paragraphs and thrown them in a pit. And one modern California American poet has referred to it as the first example of modern collage. But I find with, we are so conditioned and trained. We want things to make sense. We want the E equals MC squared. We want to be able to figure things out. And a lot of esoteric texts don't work that way. They are not as plain as the nose on your face. They stimulate us to look and see in different ways. We see the same thing, yet we see it in a different way. And then, of course, she follows Isis with The Secret Doctrine, which was another gigantic work, and which was not have been that available to the membership. If only 500 copies were printed, very few people really would have had access to it. One of the great things the Society has been famous for has been its libraries. From its very earliest days, books were not available to all and everyone. There really were no stores where one could go into and just say, I want The Secret Doctrine. And there were two lesser works. There was Mr. Sinnett's Occult World and Esoteric Buddhism that were based on his letters received from the masters. The only thing today the spiritual life is such an important part. We have so many groups, Hindu groups, Buddhist groups, where the emphasis in our movement has shifted, which is, of course, in this day and age about, to use the title of seminars given here by our past president, human regeneration. This, in a sense, is due to the impact of Krishnamurti, who in 1929 told the members, in what way has these studies made you any different than the man in the street who still gets angry, who still is fearful? In what way has this study made you any different? And that message has permeated since that time and haunted our leaders, in a sense, and has made them ponder over this. Because before that, we were taking in a lot of data and a lot of study and a lot of material. But in what way had this made us any different? Had this transformed us? So the idea today is that this has to have some transformation. It has to make you transform in some way. And that way is not perhaps to be smarter, brighter, cleverer, but to be able to take the shocks and upheavals that life gives us. And sometimes those are not the major things. These are not the great dramas in life. HPB, who really had a way with words, said there are people who are able to take the greatest hardships but step on their corns and they go crazy. So sometimes it's the little things in life that then totally throw us. And the mind then focuses on that, and we carry that and carry that. So in looking at this material, with all esoteric material, there is the obvious and there is the implied. So there is the thing that it's supposed to be telling us, but it's really telling us something else. Jung, the psychologist, was a great example by making us look at alchemical text in a different way. Instead of talking about changing the black mud into gold, it was about changing our natures and finding the higher aspects of ourselves. So in one aspect, it's one thing that they're telling you, but then something else is happening. there's a great line that illustrates this from Sri Ram talking about Annie Besant. He said, she saw the real, when she came to India, she saw the real behind the actual, even when the actual had deteriorated. She came to India and saw a culture that had been ruled and was really turning its backs on its own great spirituality, but she saw the real behind the actual, even when the actual had deteriorated. So we will look for the real behind the actual. And all of these things, a book like this, is not so much a map of what people were thinking, but what people were actually, but how people were thinking. So not what they were thinking, but how the process is. And in the spiritual life, sometimes, as they say, it's getting there. There's a phrase in that they have, Americans have, getting there is half the fun. So sometimes the process itself can be the learning. Let me just stop for a second. Any comments, questions? You're stunned into silence. Good. So the first thing she... do you want to give the first one for us? The first thing...
You want the diagram?
No, yeah. The first thing that she uses, and she constantly implies in these instructions, though she doesn't quote it over and over, is this wonderful fragment that she mentions in Isis Unveiled. Known as the Emerald Tablet of Hermes. I'll give you a minute to just look at it. The print is nice and big. Give me one. This is cut off though. See that it's partly cut off in this copy, but we will, it doesn't affect the tablet itself. So it says that this is actually from Isis Unveiled. The tradition declares that on the dead body of Hermes, the god of wisdom, at Hebron, and Ozirim found a tablet known as Smaragdim, which simply means emerald. It contains in a few sentences the essence of Hermetic wisdom. It contains in a few sentences the essence of Hermetic wisdom. To those who read but with their bodily eyes, the precepts will suggest nothing new or extraordinary, for it merely begins by saying that it speaks not fictitious things, but that which is true and most certain. And this is the key here. What is below is like that which is above, and what is above is similar to that which is below to accomplish the wonders of one thing. As all things were produced by the mediation of one being, so all things were produced from this one by adaptation. Its father is the sun, its mother is the moon. It is the cause of all perfection throughout the whole world. Its power is perfect if it is changed into earth. Separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross, acting prudently and with judgment. ascend with the greatest sagacity from the earth to heaven, and then descend again to earth, and unite together the power of things inferior and superior. Thus you will possess the light of the whole world, and all obscurity will fly away from you. This thing has more fortitude than fortitude itself, because it will overcome every subtle thing and penetrate every solid thing. By it the world was formed. It is quite a remarkable little piece. I'll just give you a moment to let it marinate, as they say, sink in. HVB's own comment on this elsewhere is that, there's a large amount of material that was known as Hermetic literature that survived. Modern esotericism, as we know it, really descends from the Renaissance. Of course, in ancient times, HVB traces the lineage of Theosophists. So in the West, we go back to, of course, the Neoplatonists of Alexandria. In ancient Alexandria, here was a very cosmopolitan city on the coast, started by Alexander the Great himself. It was Greeks. The Greeks had ruled Egypt, and then after them the Romans had ruled Egypt. But here was a city that was ruled by Greeks, that in turn brought Greek classical learning to Egypt. Egyptians themselves, traders from Asia Minor. So it really was a great cosmopolitan city, more than anywhere else in the ancient world, that were very local. Athens, Rome, all of those places were very homogeneous. And one of the things that Alexander did was to create this wonderful great library, where he brought all of the great texts of learning to this wonderful library. The Egyptians had a monopoly, really, on texts because of papyrus. There was no such thing as paper as we know it, which of course comes from wood pulp. But they used papyrus, a reed that grows along the Nile, and by dissolving it, they were able to make rolls of paper. So it was rolls, not so much the books or folios that we know today, but these were all rolls and scrolls. A later development was parchment, which was used from the skin of sheep, which was sold in lye, but the Egyptians really had this monopoly on things that you could write on. Of course, before that, everything was either chiseled in stone or a tablet. Not the tablets we have today for development, but a clay tablet. It'd be kind of hard to be carrying a whole bunch of clay tablets, especially, could you imagine the secret doctrine in clay? One would need a box to be just carrying it along. But papyrus, so it had this great civilization. The Greeks were great about civilization, and they were very curious about other cultures, and especially the Egyptian culture, that was a very old culture. As long as our Western civilization has been in existence, by the time of the birth of Christianity, Egyptian civilization had had 4,000 years of recorded texts. So it was a very old civilization, but because of its hieroglyphic language, it was a mystery to people. It wasn't something you could really read. And as you know, until the beginning of the 19th century, when they discovered the Rosetta Stone that had Greek and Egyptian and Coptic, people still couldn't read the Egyptian hieroglyphics. So from this period develops what has been known as this Corpus Hermeticum, these Hermetic books that have survived. They were those great philosophers that we know of as the Neoplatonists, because they took the stories of Plato, they took the myths around them, and then interpreted them allegorically. So the Greeks had their mystery schools, that were based around common myths, but they in turn interpreted them in an allegorical way. So one of the most famous, the rape of Persephone, where Persephone is the daughter of Demeter, the earth goddess, and she's in this field collecting all these beautiful flowers, and the earth opens up, and Hades pulls her down to the underworld, where she stays. And her mother, who becomes so upset, stops taking an interest in agriculture and the production of grain and all of those things, and the world becomes barren. And eventually, even the gods dismay at this, so they have a compromise with Hades that Proserpine Kore, as she's known in the mystery school, spends 6 months in the underworld, at which time the earth is barren because she's mourning, and in 6 months she comes back to the world and everything blooms and her mother is happy. The Neoplatonists would interpret this as the fall of the soul into the underworld that we are living in, and the thing that draws us into the underworld, here she's in a field of flowers, all of the sensate world, then makes us fall into that world of barrenness and of the underworld. So from this area, but then of course, as you know, Christianity develops, and there is sort of a putting away of any other way of looking at anything. There's sort of no room. And then you have other monotheistic cults where it's just simply one book or one system. As you know, Islam comes around, and then when they finally conquer Alexandria with its great library, they write to the Caliph, and they ask him what to do with all of these huge, rooms and rooms full of texts. And he says, well, if it agrees with the Quran, burn it, because there's no need for it. And if it doesn't agree with the Quran, definitely burn it. And they used it to heat the baths. They had huge public baths, so they heated the baths as furnace for years and years and years. But HPB suggests that of the real Hermetic books, there remains only a fragment known as the Emerald Tablet. So she feels out of all of this Hermetic material that has survived, there is really this Emerald Tablet that is the most actual thing. And all of these texts surfaced during the Renaissance, where there was a great revival of interest in classical learning, which you see then influencing especially the arts. You see a lot of themes from pagan literature surviving in sculpture and the arts. And you notice one of the greatest pieces of Western art, the Sistine Chapel, with its wonderful fresco. Michelangelo has painted, of course, the themes of Christianity from the creation of man onwards. And then on the sides, he has the prophets in the Old Testament, and then counter to them is the Sibyls, these female figures who were the receivers of texts of wisdom, balancing them off. And it's from this time that we see Hermeticism being translated into Latin by a fluke. Do you know this word, fluke? It's a American word, a fluke, or by happenstance or chance. A text survived and was brought to Italy, and they translated it. And in 1471, it became literally a bestseller. It just went through myriads and myriads of printings. And we see then the entry also then of other themes, Kabbalistic literature, the whole Kabbalah and the Tree of Life, the rise of the whole Rosicrucian movement in the 17th century that talked about a universal reformation where all people could live and work together. And it's a time where Europe was really scarred by the 30 Years' Wars. It's amazing to think that not only world wars in Europe, but internecine wars between factions and countries had just gone on and on and on. Masonry comes in the 18th century, another great movement that promised fraternité, égalité, regardless if you were a servant, or a nobleman or a Jew within the Masonic framework and hall, everyone had the same equality. But of course, who did they leave out? Who did the Masons leave out? Women. Everybody was equal except women. Right? All men were equal. In fact, Shelley's wife wrote a wonderful piece on the rights of women. It was just outrageous, and she was mocked terribly that women would have any sort of equal rights. It's amazing how things change in such a short time. That women of course couldn't own property. Even by the time HPV came to America, of course women didn't have the vote. You couldn't own property. You couldn't check into a hotel by yourself. You had to either have a chaperone or a man with you. Yes, and then of course our wonderful Theosophical movement comes along in 1875, and it opens the doors to all, regardless of race, creed, caste, sex, or color, which was a very radical idea for that time in a world that was very segregated. I can even remember as a young person, a marriage between a Catholic and a Protestant was considered shocking. Shocking, I tell you. But the idea in here, for the first time, so all of these lodges developed, and women could become heads of lodges, presidents, be elected at a time when society wouldn't allow them those roles. They could speak, go out and lecture. A remarkable thing at that time. So she says that of the real Hermetic books, there remains only this fragment. All the works compiled on the books of thought, the Egyptian god of wisdom, were destroyed and burnt in Egypt by the order of Diocletian in the 3rd century of our era. All others are in their present form merely recollections, more or less vague and erroneous, of different Greek or Latin authors who did not hesitate to palm off their own interpretations as genuine Hermetic fragments. So we know very little of that world. Very little has truly survived. By the way, are you familiar with this text known as the Metamorphosis of Lucius Apuleius? It's also known as the Golden Ass.
Joy Mills.
Yeah. No, Joy Mills didn't write it, though she's old enough probably.
Yeah, but she talked a lot about it.
It's
we read it in high school.
Oh, good. You see, it's a wonderful text that survives in Latin. This is just a digression. It's a wonderful text that survives in Latin. It's probably the oldest surviving novel as we have. And it's the story of somewhat bawdy story of a young man who goes to Thessaly and falls in love with a servant, and who works for a witch, and the witch every night covers herself in an ointment and turns into a bird and flies off to her lover. And of course he is curious just to get this effect and experience, and has her steal some of this ointment, but she gets the wrong ointment, is distracted, and he turns into an ass, into a donkey instead. And the thing that will save him, it's very simple, he just has to eat some white roses. But every time this comes along, something comes up that prevents it. But in the middle of this story, suddenly, he tells this wonderful allegory of Cupid and Psyche. It is really remarkable. And then the novel goes along, and some parts are just really quite shocking for our sensibilities today. But suddenly at the end, he's gone through so many terrible, terrible things, seen so many horrible things. Suddenly he's going to go to the ocean and drown himself. And as the moon is rising, he has a vision of the goddess Isis as the universal mother of all things. And she tells them that tomorrow there will be a procession in town of my devotees. And as they are coming along, all you have to do is to go there and eat some of those white roses. And which he does, and of course turns into, back from his animal form into a human being, which must have been a great coup for the priest, who was suddenly going along and an ass turns into a human being. Sure, it made the local news. But at the end of it, then, he says that he in turn becomes a devotee of Isis. And he says that he gets initiated into the mysteries. And it's very curious. He says, I know you are curious for what happens there, but all I can tell you is that I saw the sun rise at midnight. I passed through the regions infernal and supernal and came back down to earth, somewhat similar to this. So here we are with this emerald tablet. We're getting close to the break time, so do you want to stop there, any questions, and then we'll take the break and look a little further, or? Yes.
At the beginning of the second line of this sheet.
Ozarim.
Yes, who is that?
It means just simply an initiate, an uzurim. So just a word meaning an initiate. That's why she has it in the parenthesis next to it.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can the underworld be understood as subconscious?
Of course.
Okay.
HPB's great contribution is that there are 7 levels of interpretation. Anything can be interpreted in 7 different levels or ways. It can be allegorical, it can be symbolical. There are so many different levels of interpreting the same thing. So that's one of the things that has kept our movement and our society so elastic and free, is that there is not only one way of seeing something, that there are many different ways. Our movement has in turn been able to accommodate many different types of views and people, though theosophists haven't.
May I say something?
Yes.
She talked about subconscious, and yesterday you talked about the aspects of the principles, the 7 principles. And maybe you can say it is 7 states of consciousness, different states of consciousness.
Not so much different. We can say levels, but even, as HVB points out, the language, our modern European languages, don't have this wide background of dealing with these things. Of course, Sanskrit has so many more subtleties, so you can't, even states is erroneous, levels of consciousness are
Spheres.
Even spheres, because even when we think of it like the layers of an onion, that is also incorrect. Because consciousness has no division, really. How can you divide consciousness? Of course, as time progresses and as we progress, we will see things in different ways, because we still, at our level of evolution, we see the differences, not the similarities. Right? Yes, Colin.
Yeah, when we raise our consciousness, so that we actually experience in what we call intuition, we are actually getting if you like, a greater intensity of consciousness.
Perhaps frequency or intensity might be the level. For instance, look at something like the ocean. As you go down to different levels, there's different pressures. You could survive at one level, but not survive at another level. But it's not separate layers or states. The Neoplatonists like to use the example, which we will deal with later, of an emanationism. There's only one reality, one substance, one thing, but it manifests like a fountain flowing out of itself in different ways. So water can manifest steam, water, and ice, right? Something can be steam, it can be a cloud, it can be rain, it can turn into water, and it can become ice, yet it's the same substance, but manifesting on different planes. So this consciousness that is manifesting on all of these states, planes, we will probe all of these things, hopefully. Yes?
Just as one single word, correlation, I think is really helpful.
Correlation, yes.
Correlation of the levels of consciousness, if you want to use the word levels, with the 7 principles and all the other 7s. Jeffrey Farley makes this point again and again, is that if there's a lot of meaning you can penetrate the meaning a lot better if you look at the way in which the different factors correlate with each other. And he produces in one of his books a table of correlations.
Yes, we will look at some of those in the next segment of this. By the way, I hear some theosophists are planning to do a television series on this, Correlation Street. Yes.
I have a question about the school, the esoteric school.
Yes.
It started in the beginning of 1888.
The end of October 1888. October 1888.
Well, I've seen reports from it from January until June 1888, and then it stopped. And my question is, why did it stop?
I think you're thinking of the reports of the Blavatsky Lodge.
Yes.
Where that's January to June 1889, not 1888.
1889?
1889, yeah.
But
Yeah,
Blavatsky died in...
91.
Yeah.
So why did she stop in 89?
They took a break for the summer. It's as simple as that. And for the Blavatsky Lodge, which is still in existence, by the way, we are amazing. Blavatsky Lodge in London is actually one of the oldest surviving lodges still in existence. Blavatsky Lodge in Bombay, one of the very oldest, it's from 1879, still surviving, the old Bombay TS. So there are all of these lodges, but I think they just simply went away for the summer. London, in those days they didn't have air conditioning, and they didn't have, the Victorians didn't believe like we did about light and fresh air. The idea of fresh air, they considered dangerous. People lived in very closed rooms that, and so they only had gaslight also. You can imagine, of course, the dust must have been unbelievable. They didn't have washing and dry cleaning as we did. Barely had water. Toilets had just been brought in. So it certainly was a different world. And I think simply just people took a break. People went away for the summer. Or London just would have been simply unbearable for people to come and meet. Travel. You could imagine the stench on the street from the horse-drawn carriages.
And did they pick it up again in September?
They started in September, but they took a new topic of study. They took the Gospel of St. John, was it? The Gospel of St. John from September 1889. But that's not the esoteric school. That's just the Blavatsky Lodge. That's different from her esoteric school. Because they didn't have regular meetings, the esoteric school. It was a school by instruction. Though HPB did ask anyone who had applied to send in a photograph. Wondered where all of those photographs would be today of all those early members.
Thank you.
So, I think that's the transactions of Blavatsky Lodge that survived. Any other questions before we take our break?